Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. This event is called Using Data for Budget Transparency with the Independent Budget Office. So all three of us presenting today are employees at the Independent Budget Office, or IBO, and we're going to be presenting on papers that we have each authored in our time at IBO. I'm going to be talking about stormwater fees, Valerie will talk about police overtime trends, and then Emma will talk about the state of New York City's public education. So by way of intro, my name's Brian Cain. I am our Assistant Director for Housing, Environment, and Infrastructure. So I manage one of our 5 analytical teams, and my team specifically focuses on those areas. Valerie?
And my name is Valerie Gudino. I'm a budget and policy analyst on the social and community services team, specifically covering public safety. And the agencies that I cover are NYPD, FDNY, and the CCRB. And Emma? Hi, my name is Emma Gossett. I am a budget and policy analyst on the education team here at IBO. I focus on a lot of different things. My specialty is in early childhood education, although this presentation will not reflect that. I do just want to finally note that if you really love our presentation, we're doing it again on Saturday at the School of Data Day. So feel free to come along and ask more questions.
Absolutely. Good reminder, Emma. So yeah, and then just one more quick note before we start on the topics is, who is the Independent Budget Office? IBO is a city government agency. We're funded by the city government through our city budget, and we are part of the city government. However, we are independent of the political process. So we aren't managed or overseen by an elected official like the mayor or city council. This allows our analysis to be independent and nonpartisan. The city charter protects our budget, and it gives us unique data access to allow us to fulfill our mandate, which is researching the city's budget, policy, and economy. We frequently use open data to fulfill that mandate, and that's what we're going to be partially discussing today. We encourage you to check out this QR code, or I'm going to put the link in the chat right now, which is a landing page for all information from this event. It's got our social media, it's got all 3 reports that we're going to be discussing today. It's a great resource, and the QR code will pop up again towards the end. So to get into the content today, the first report that I'm going to be discussing is called The Potential Implications of a Stormwater Fee in New York City. I co-authored this with Jordan Paige, who I believe is in the audience today, and this came out in November of 2023. So the first thing you need to understand is, what is stormwater and why is it a problem? When it rains, stormwater hits hard surfaces and runs across them, creating runoff. And this runoff causes expensive damage to public infrastructure, and it overflows the city's sewer system, which causes ecological problems. And so it's a big issue. Impervious surfaces increase runoff, and pervious surfaces decrease runoff. This is a helpful diagram here. The yellow surfaces are impervious, and so like roofs, driveways, pavement, they increase the amount of water that's going to run across them, and therefore they're contributing to the problem of stormwater runoff. While the green areas, the pervious surfaces like lawns and bushes and trees, they detain stormwater until it can naturally re-enter the water cycle. So the big concern here is that in New York City and a lot of other cities, stormwater management, the cost of dealing with stormwater, is currently paid by water bills. But water bills are a reflection of how much clean water a property uses from their tap, from their showers, things like that. There's no correlation with that and how much stormwater runoff a property is contributing. Therefore, several cities in the US and outside the US have come up with another solution: stormwater fees. Stormwater fees charge property owners for their impervious surfaces. This forces properties to internalize the cost that they're having from contributing to stormwater runoff, and it generates revenue for that important stormwater infrastructure. Excuse me. In New York State, there is currently only one city that has a stormwater fee, and it's Ithaca, New York. Now, proponents of stormwater fees, such as Assemblymember Emily Gallagher, believe that this is because the law is a little bit ambiguous about whether or not cities in New York can just implement a stormwater fee if they want. So the Assemblymember, who represents Greenpoint and Williamsburg, has proposed a bill at the state level to clarify that any city that wants one in New York can make a stormwater fee. They can charge it, they can collect the revenue. Around the same time that proposal was being made, the Assemblymember reached out to IBO and asked us to research what would it look like if New York City had a stormwater fee. So we dove into 3 more specific questions, at least on the data side of things. Our full report has a little more information, but on the data side of things, I wanted to know how much revenue could this raise for New York City? What would fees look like for specific properties and by property type? And then how much would these fees burden residential properties? Like, is this a lot of their income? Is it a really small fee? And so that's what we wanted to look into. And I'll just note, I'm really only going to go into questions 1 and 3 in the main presentation here. I have a slide on question 2 in the appendix if people are interested at the end, but just for time's sake, sticking to 1 and 3. So what data did we use? It's Open Data Week. Let's talk data. Our main data set was from Open Data, and it is called the Department of Environmental Protection's Citywide Parcel-Based Impervious Area GIS Study, which is a mouthful. I'm just going to call it the DEP data. And to show you what that looks like, I have a couple screenshots. This one's just from Google Maps. It's not the data set. But we have an aerial view of about 4 houses in a neighborhood in Eastern Brooklyn. You can see their roofs. You can see some trees, lawns, driveways. This is that same picture, but in ArcGIS mapping this DEP data. So what this data set did is they used machine learning to label every single surface in the city as a certain class. And there are 18 classes. And the tan color here is roof. There's like a green color that's lawn. That light blue green color is the driveway. And so they labeled 18 different types of surfaces. And they also labeled everything as either impervious or pervious, which is really all we needed. But I wanted you to see how detailed this data is because it's a great resource. It's also a very big resource. It's a very large data set. And to make it usable for us and not crash our computers, we did have to use R to pare it down to be 1 observation per property lot. Because as you can see here, one of these houses or one of these properties has about 10 polygons on it, 10 shapes, and each of those shapes is a separate row in the data. So minimizing it down was a big step in cleaning for us. And then we also used a different data set called the Pluto data set. This is a great data set if you haven't already used it. It's got very detailed information on every property lot in New York City. And we used it to label every property by type, residential, commercial. There's 12 property types that are more granular than that. But so yeah, what did we do? We started by merging those 2 data sets that I just described by property lot. And specifically, that's borough, block, and lot number, or BBL. That's the specific identifier for any lot in New York City. We then applied the stormwater fees of peer cities to every New York City property. These peer cities of Baltimore, Philadelphia, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. have all had stormwater fees for several years now. And they're some of the largest cities in the US that have stormwater fees. So we thought they were pretty good use cases to see what it would look like in New York City. We then ran some summary stats to answer questions 1 and 2, and we created a new variable and mapped it for question 3, and I'll get into that in a moment. So, to the results. Here we have the revenue projections by peer stormwater fee, but these are all projections for New York City. The far left bar there that says Baltimore, that is if New York City adopted a stormwater fee that looked exactly like Baltimore's stormwater fee. That would produce about $260 million in revenue, maximum. And then Washington, D.C., if we took on their version of the stormwater fee, New York City could raise up to about $900 million. So the real takeaway here is an order of magnitude. If New York City adopted a stormwater fee that was in line with our peers, it could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in that order of magnitude. And then the last thing here that I'll share is our financial burden analysis. Like I was saying, we're skipping over question 2. And the real reason I'm doing that is because the finding was somewhat obvious to us. The larger the property, on average, the higher the stormwater fee. And I still think that's useful information, but ultimately we want to know how large is this stormwater fee? How significant is this burden on especially residential properties? So to do this, we had to create a new variable. We took the stormwater fee that we estimated for every property in the city, and we divided it by the number of residential units on that property. That allowed us to compare a single family home that is presumably paying the full stormwater fee with that household to a, let's say, 100-unit large elevator building that could at least split apart its stormwater fee across all of its units. This is all just a proxy, so it's not going to mirror what happens in real life, but we think it's about as good as we could do. We then took that stormwater fee per unit and divided it by the median household income of the census tract where the property is located. So we found the median of this financial burden metric for every census tract in the city, and it produced these maps. As you can see in the top left, we've got Baltimore's rate structure, and then bottom we've got Washington, D.C. And the darker orange means greater financial burden as a percentage of income. And what we find here is that the further you get from Manhattan, the more likely it is that the burden is higher. And we think that there's three main reasons why this might be happening, or the data shows this. The first is that there's larger average property sizes the further you get from Manhattan. There's also lower population density and lower median income. So the archetype here is in Manhattan, you might have a lot of relatively affluent people living in a tall elevator building with hundreds of units. There's not very much surface area per person compared to a single family home out in Eastern Queens that might have a decent sized driveway, and that entire stormwater fee is the burden of that single household. We will note though, however, even in the most expensive rate structure, Washington, D.C., very few census tracts at the median would get above a 1% of income stormwater fee. So for the most part, it's less than 1% annually for the stormwater fee. Now, whether or not that's high is up to the eye of the beholder, but that is the takeaway that we found on this analysis. So that's the presentation that we prepared for this. I think, going to hand off to Valerie now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. So our second topic today is on the report called Police Overtime Trends, examining the relationship between tenure and overtime hours worked. So let's get started. And I wanted to also get started with the fact that if you have any questions specifically on the report or methodologies in particular, or the submitted code that I'll be sharing, please feel free to reach out with any specific questions that you may have, and my contact information will be found at the end of the presentation. So today I'm going to be taking you through the process of and methodology behind this project and report, while also demonstrating the power of data visualization and how a single chart can tell a very compelling story. In this case, the story highlights the relationship between tenure and overtime hours for NYPD personnel in 2024. So particularly this report examined the relationship between tenure and overtime hours usage for uniformed NYPD personnel in 2024. And the research question that we sought to answer as part of this project was if there was a relationship between tenure and overtime usage for NYPD personnel. So to start, I'm going to provide an overview of overtime and the types of overtime that there are. So to get started with the types of overtime, there are various types of overtime, including covering shifts, maintaining staffing levels during high demand periods, or special events, such as parades, protests, or holidays. And there are various ways to measure overtime in particular. As you can see on the chart on the screen, between 2019 and 2024, NYPD overtime spending has ranged from $600 million to $955 million. And the bar chart on the screen shows overtime costs and how they have increased. One thing I wanted to note is that in 2021, it's particularly an outlier in this chart as it relates to NYPD overtime spending, given that 2021 was amidst COVID-19. And in 2024, uniform overtime spending made up a full 16% of the NYPD's budget. So now moving on to the next slide, which is we'll get into the type of data that we use, the data set that we used in this report. So we use the Office of Payroll Administration, OPA, citywide payroll data by fiscal year, open data set, which has data and salary and overtime pay for all New York City employees. Next, I'm going into the methodology specifically used for this analysis. So since the data contained many different agencies and lots of information, all types of titles, including civilian and uniforms and active and departed employees, we filtered the data into R, specifically for NYPD, uniform titles in particular, and active employees for this analysis. And as you can see on the right, this is a snippet of the code that was used, which could be helpful when looking at this data set and understanding how we came to our findings and use the report. We created new variables for the agencies. We created new variables, and one of the variables that we created was the agency's start date, end of fiscal year, and days of tenure as of the given fiscal year, as well as the tenure bucket that the number fell into, which I will speak about momentarily. So in this project, new variables were created to help organize and analyze the data more effectively. And specifically, we generated variables for the agency's start date, the end of the fiscal year, the number of days of tenure by the end of the fiscal year, and the tenure group which each officer fell into. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different creation of the variables and how that occurred and how we did that in the code. The new variable that tracks the difference between the start date and the fiscal year end, groups that the groups were into tenure into categories or buckets to make it easier to analyze how officers in different tenure groups worked overtime hours. So this allowed the analysis to be grouped the data into meaningful categories, and this made it simpler to identify patterns and trends. So I'm going to speak a little bit about tenure groups now. So we organized the analysis into tenure groups, which are groups of NYPD personnel bucketed in by their respective start dates, how many full years they have been with the NYPD for that entire fiscal year. IBO also had to determine what personnel had uniform titles, since the data set does not specify. So only uniformed officers are included in this analysis. And throughout the process of analyzing the open data set, IBO found data challenges with the open data set. This including title descriptions not fully matching other city data sets. So despite these data challenges and not having a 100% match rate amongst uniform title descriptions, the matching was better than expected, and we had enough titles to match thanks to the manual matching that we did in R with the title descriptions that were provided to us by the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. So the tenure years specifically move over time, and individual NYPD personnel will move in tenure buckets as they go from group to group. So we also calculated the median average of overtime hours worked throughout the entire year by each tenure group. So we included the headcount of uniformed officers on payroll as of June 30th, 2024 in this analysis specifically. So this is, as I said, the code is on the screen, and that's the idea of the methodology. And next, we're going to move on. So we're going to jump into the findings. So I will conclude by going through the findings of this report. So we'll get started with the bar chart on the screen, the bar chart section of this that shows the head count of uniformed officers on payroll as of June 30th, 2024. And the two line charts show the average and median number of overtime hours worked by each tenure group. So this report found that there is a positive statistical relationship between tenure and overtime hours worked. And this is particularly between the group of 12 to 14 years of tenure to the group of 21 to 23 years of tenure. So we included the headcount bars in this chart to represent the trends in the specific groups of tenure. And this made it easy to visualize how the number of officers varies across tenure groups. So now I'm going to go into the effective storytelling with data. So the bar charts and the two line charts allow for a clear visual representation of key trends within the data. So the line charts track the average and median overtime hours worked by officers in different levels of different tenure groups. And this highlights the relationship between these variables and overall like our findings and the research question we sought to answer. So the combination of the bar and the line charts makes complex data in this large data set more accessible and a visualized way that allows for easier understanding. So by showing both headcount and overtime hours worked, the findings in the chart demonstrates how staffing levels can show a relationship, or how we can show a relationship between overtime trends and giving an overall picture of the department's overtime spend, NYPD's overtime spending, as well as overtime hours worked, specifically overtime hours worked in tenure. The data and overtime out, specifically the data visualization in the chart shows overtime hours in an easy to interpret manner, and emphasizing our finding that we found that I had mentioned earlier. So I'm also going to speak about the trends between the relationship between the median and average. So the decline so with the average line specifically, it falls a little bit quicker than the median, suggesting that the top earners who work more the most overtime do retire first. So that's a trend, a trend that I'm going to highlight. So the use of both average and the median overtime hours, because you may be wondering, why we use both, and the line charts allow for a deeper understanding of our findings in the data. And then I also want to discuss that discussing that both metrics. This highlights how the retirements of top earners just shows the overall trend and provide valuable insights for future research. So though the median and the average lines, which the average is the light blue and the median is the purple, or that you met earlier, although they have similar trends, we included both because the average is higher for NYPD personnel working the most amount of overtime hours and are therefore sometimes, in some cases, pulling up the average a little bit. And as around 20 years, this trend actually flips. And the median with the highest earners are being steep with the retiring first. So we looked at both the median and the average. So as I mentioned, we looked at both the median and the average overtime hours work. And I mentioned earlier, the blue line represents the median, and the blue line represents the average, and the purple represents the median throughout the entire. This represents it throughout the entire fiscal year. So as I mentioned earlier, the average it seems to fall quicker than the median does, and this implies that the top earners are leading first. So we structured it this way because this is the clearest way to answer our research question that we stopped to answer across years and trends across the different years. As IBO continues to track the issue of overtime, IBO's future research will look into more details surrounding overtime hours usage by the department. So next, I'm going to discuss visualizing officer distribution and how the bar chart helps to identify how the bar chart visualizes the distribution of tenure groups. So this chart overall helps to create a deeper understanding and analysis of how the overtime hours and tenure relationship, and the question that we sought to answer that I mentioned earlier, our research question. This overall helps to make the data visualized and easy to understand the patterns of overtime hours worked and how it evolves over time, and when it evolves over time as officers gain experience and as they move in their tenure. So specifically, the chosen format of displaying both headcount and overtime data was pretty intentional, and it structures the data in the clearest possible way to help answer our research question that we've got to answer. And this structured approach overall enables both data exploration and as well as a clear communication and for future insights, as well as fostering a better understanding of how the relationship between tenure and overtime hours works, as well as just different trends. So moving on to the to conclude. So this report and its visualizations overall demonstrate the power of data visualization by translating complex information into an easy to understand and digestible format. And this allows really for easier quicker interpretation, easier interpretation of trends as well as patterns that we sought to answer through our research question. And the visual clarity of the bar charts and line charts helps us to uncover relationships between tenure and overtime hours worked, and helped us to help answer our research question that we had. And this also provides both actionable insights and a clear foundation for future research moving forward about overtime usage within the department. And that's my presentation, and I am passing it to Emma.
Thank you so much. All right. For a bit of a topic shift, once again, I'm going to be discussing education indicators, which is an annual publication put out by the IBO's education team, which I will go into more now as well. So about indicators and just IBO more broadly. So as Brian mentioned earlier, we have a charter that allows us to have access to data. The education team actually has additional oversight that was provided to us by under state education law in, I believe, 2009. And so we are able to access data directly from the New York City Department of Education that gets sent directly to us. But this data is very protected and it's not publicly available. We get student level data that is very protected. And so the way that we seek to be a resource for the public is through indicators. This is one of the many ways we do this. So Indicators itself is an annual publication. It is updated in the summer or the fall, and we see it as a reference document for New York City public education. And the real goal is accessibility. We want anybody to be able to come and access this resource. And because the data isn't accessible in its format, we aggregate that in a way that we hope is the most accessible and the most helpful as well. But I do want to note that it is mostly aggregate, but I'm going to go into some examples of what indicators is and how we focus on accessibility, not just in the charts, but just broadly with the data. So very briefly, this is an overview of what's in indicators. I'm not going to go over all of this, but this is just the sections that we include. We have student information, we have teacher information, and some building information for students. I'm going to go into some specifics. So for student demographics, just the overview, I'm just going to show you the very first chart that we have on our website. This is what it looks like on the indicators landing page. So this is a snapshot of New York City public schools in 2023 to 2024 school year. So that is last school year. I want to note that some of our data is 1 year lagged due to data availability, but this is from the most recent completed school year. So in this chart, what you see is the total number of students in a variety of programs. So we provide total number of traditional public school students in grades 3K through 12. For those who don't know, 3K is for 3-year-olds. It's a pre-kindergarten program. So basically, ages 3 through grade 12 is what that number is for traditional public schools. Right next to that, in green, we provide the total charter school students, and below we have a number of other breakouts. I want to note the colors specifically because they correlate to one another. So for example, on the left, we see the traditional public school students and programs, and those are the same color. So we think about, really what we're thinking about is cognitive load. And what that means pretty simply is just, what does it take for you to read a chart? How hard is it for you cognitively, mentally, to look at a chart and go, that makes sense? And so for this, for example, color coordination, just like pretty simple representation of the numbers was the ultimate goal. Another chart on the same page is right here. And this is showing what type of schools New York City students attend. And this shows non-public in pink, charter in green, and traditional public in purple. And I want to note again, this is another example of maintaining the same colors throughout, just for ease of clarity, ease of cognitive load. And I also want to note that we include asterisks and notes at the very bottom. So as you can see in both of these charts, there are notes on what this actually represents and how to interpret it. We also have a separate data notes and glossary page, which I will also go into. So this is just the overview of the student demographic page. I'm going to focus on some other more specific charts now. So this is student demographics, traditional public schools. So the first chart I'm going to show you is just very broad. This is total enrollment in traditional public schools from 2014-15 to 2023-24. This is a 10-year look at enrollment in traditional public schools. What's important here is just the trend. And as you can see, the 2023-2024 year there has that same number that we saw in the previous chart. And some interesting findings in this chart. You can see that dip between 2019-20 and 2020-21, which is that COVID enrollment decline, which we have seen. And so this is an example of how indicators can spark future research. So we have people on our team working on COVID related projects. And so this may be an example of, oh, that's an interesting finding. What else can we do? So that is one chart. And then I wanted to show another example of a graphic. So I really like using maps. I think they're pretty easy to read, and especially a map like this. So this is a map looking at, again, the total number of traditional public school students, but this breaks it out by borough. And so what you're seeing right here is a map, and it's the gradient of color is what is representative of the total enrollment. And so you can pretty easily see that Queens has a lot more enrollment than Staten Island. And again, the notes on the bottom are important. So the borough reflects the location of the school, not necessarily the residence of the student. That's an example of a data note that's important to recognize. Next, I'm going to look at some other charts. These are charter school related. So in our indicators publication, for most of our pages, we have a traditional public school page and a charter school page for folks to be able to go through and look at the different charts. So I'm going to show some examples of charts on this page, but I do want to note that these same breakouts are available for traditional public school students on that page as well. So this is a chart that is looking at the share of charter school students who are English language learners by grade breakout. And as you can see, we use the same color, we use blue, but they're different shades. So you can easily identify which is the different category. And you see some interesting things pop out in this chart specifically. So you can see that in students in grades K through 5, there's a higher share of students who are English language learners as opposed to in grades 9 through 12. So that's just, again, an interesting thing to note. Indicators it doesn't seek to explain why, but it seeks to be a resource. Another chart is the share of charter school students with disabilities. Again, this is available for traditional public schools too. And on this chart, we see something interesting. That's the opposite trend of the English language learners, where pre-K students and grades K through 5 have lower rates of students with disabilities than higher grades 6 through 8 and 9 through 12. Again, just an interesting thing. And then again, that data note at the bottom, students' disabilities includes any student who has an individualized education plan, an IEP, which is basically just a document that identifies the additional supports that students need based on disability. So that's just the charter school page. So now accessibility and data visualization. So I'm about to show you my favorite chart in the piece. It is on attendance in traditional public schools. And this chart went through a lot of iterations. And I want to note that indicators just broadly is a living, breathing resource. And so every year it's different. Every year we update it because we're constantly thinking about how can we be more accessible? How can we provide more context? How can we be more of a resource? So this is the attendance graph. This is looking at grades 9 through 12 attendance. And so I want to first note, just on the top, it gives you the average attendance, the 88.2%. And that's right on the top, so that if the graph itself is overwhelming, which it certainly looks a little bit overwhelming upon first glance, you have that just right at the top that you can go to. And then we do provide further breakouts. So as you can see, we provide demographic breakouts. So gender, race, disability status, language learning status, neighborhood income level, and housing status. And I want to note that these breakouts, again, within each grouping are the same color so that you can compare within each group, but they are not comparable across. I also want to note that gradient does not imply population or anything like that. It is just ease of readability. I also want to note, again, on indicators being a living, breathing document, that in the most recent indicators, there was a category added to the gender category, and that was neither male nor female. Now, this is a new category that DOE is using. So this is not an IBO creation, but we saw that there was a new category, and we decided that it would be important to include that as well. So again, always updating, always thinking how we can improve. So that is that graph. And next, I'm going to show you my favorite page, which is the data notes and glossary page, but it's going to be overwhelming. So just keep with me. First, this is just the data notes and glossary. And this this is the glossary. It's just the definition of a variety of things. So for example, in attendance, there's something called chronically absent. And that may not be something that is very clear or something that you know about. And so here you can go here and it defines how we define chronically absent. Other examples, it defines what District 75 and District 79 are, because those are New York City specific things, New York City education specific things that are not necessarily common knowledge. So that's the glossary. And then we have data notes. So this is just one data note on poverty, because poverty is a measure that we have multiple different measures for quote unquote poverty. So we have a measure for not low income and low income. We saw that previously in other charts. But we also have like further categories. So we have high, medium, and low poverty, and we have a school share of poverty. So there's just a lot. I'm not going to have you read this or anything like that, but I just wanted to note that we go through all of these kinds of things in the data notes. This is an example of a chart that we put in the data notes as additional context so you can see where our thresholds are. So how can you use indicators? Indicators, again, is charts in the aggregate, but we do allow you to download the data. So while it is not currently on the Open Data website, it is on the IBO website. And the way that you can do that is this download data button in the left-hand bottom of each chart. So almost every single chart has one. And when you download it, it looks like this. It'll provide you those categories and the levels that you see here in that chart. The next step is working with Open Data to format our data for indicators in a way that we could upload it to the Open Data website and feasibly annually update that with the most recent data. But as of right now, it is on our website. And yeah. So that is the end of our presentation. If you would like to read any of our reports, all of the reports, this QR code will take you there. Also, please follow NYC IBO and join our newsletter. We have lots of good stuff, I promise. And questions?
Awesome. Thank you both, Valerie and Emma. There were a few great questions that came in through the chat. If I can just find them again. Yeah, actually, one thing was more of a note, and it was from Michelle. They said, just something extra that might add to Val's analysis. Sometimes overtime is compensated with comp days, extra vacation days, and not in financial compensation. It might involve a more in-depth look into city timekeeping data, but that's what Michelle noted.
Great. That's a great note. Thank you.
Yeah, and then this one was a question. Marnie asked, what was the reason to track NYPD overtime data for this report?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons to track the overtime data for this report was specifically we really wanted to answer the research question and just examine the relationship between tenure and overtime hours worked. And we're really curious on the relationship between it. And specifically, we wanted to understand the relationship and we want to understand this relationship because it's crucial to understanding the drivers of overtime spending too. And we thought that was important to note and to look into. And it's been a focus of oversight in particular it's been a focus of oversight really under overtime and with the rising overtime costs. So it's something we wanted to look into. And this data does help us to identify patterns in overtime hours usage and helps us to focus on future research and understand these patterns, particularly among the officers that are approaching retirement. We thought that was really interesting to note and to look into. And this could influence specific we just thought it was important to look into to analyze this relationship in particular, and we thought it was a great research question to answer. Yeah,
great. There was one more question for your report, Valerie.
Sure.
Stephen asked, they just wanted to check that they're reading the OT hours graph correctly. So, for example, an officer that is at the tenure group of 21 to 23 years is around 400 hours. So if you divide 400 hours by 52 weeks in a year, you get about 7.7 hours of overtime per week. Is that the correct way to interpret that?
So we didn't specifically look at the weekly breakdown for this specific chart, but if you have any specific questions or you'd like me to walk through the chart with you, I'm happy to feel free to reach out to me. My contact information would probably be at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to walk through I'm happy to walk through the data as well as the chart and explaining the different aspects of the chart and how to read it. Yeah. So if you have any
But each
specific
bar is basically, sorry, not the bar.
questions, it's
The lines.
a line.
Yeah, the lines are the median overtime worked for someone in that tenure group for the year.
The average and median of overtime hours worked. Yes, specifically for and then
Yeah.
tenure group. Yes, but I'm happy to go into particular specifics if you'd like.
That's great. No, thank you. Marnie asked, it seems like attendance at school is pretty good amongst all the different groups. Did you find anything alarming in your school data, Emma?
That's a great question. I think we found a lot of interesting things. I don't know that alarming is a word that we would use. I think some things that I found interesting about the attendance data is that students in grades 9 through 12 have lower attendance rates than students in grades K through 5. That's one thing that's very interesting. But again, go read the report, see what you think there. We also provide chronic absenteeism rates, which is different. So we do provide the attendance rate, which is what I showed you. But on that same page, we have chronic absenteeism rates.
Great. Marty also asked, is NYPD overtime different from other uniformed overtime?
So that's a great question. It's a great question. I'm gonna skip back to you on that one, but uniformed like overtime does specifically refer to overtime worked by like uniformed officers. And this term is different, obviously, from civilian, not obviously, but from civilian overtime. But I'm going to get back to some specifics if that's okay. But yeah, I would say it would be different.
Maybe just for Marnie, mention the other uniform agencies if you have them off the top of your
Yes,
head.
of course. So other uniform agencies are like the Department of Corrections, DSNY, that's sanitation, and FDNY. So I would say it would be different. Yeah, it's just different based off of the uniformed, because uniformed can mean different types of uniformed agencies, and the ones that we covered there, yeah, there's 4. Yeah.
I'll just recap verbally an exchange that I had in the chat with Fanny about implementing stormwater fees to supplement combined sewer overflows infrastructure. And basically, the idea that many cities have behind stormwater fees is to raise revenue to then use on stormwater management infrastructure, which can be like combined sewer overflow detention tanks, where we hold it in a tank instead of dumping the untreated wastewater into the waterways, which is what currently happens on days of heavy rain. That's one of those expensive and bad ecological costs from stormwater runoff. So yes, it's a great question and a great connection to make. Like addressing those combined sewer overflows is the goal of stormwater fees. But I feel like I saw one other question that I wanted to go back to. Oh, Marnie did ask what the likelihood of stormwater fees being implemented in New York City is, and it's a great question, but IBO can't really speak to that because it really depends on political support and public opinion. That said, hundreds of US cities already have stormwater fees, and with climate change increasing the amount and severity of storms, those costs from stormwater runoff are probably going to increase in magnitude, which will force the city to consider creative ways to address the problem. And stormwater fees is one option. Great. And also anyone can raise their hand and speak up if they want to ask a verbal question. Doesn't have to be through the chat.
Hi, I have a question.
Please.
It's about community boards and how they operate. And I live in Queens, right? And it seems like some of the community boards can overlap each other. And you could utilize that money to get urban planners, because we have this whole discussion about zoning, and most of the members are not really qualified that don't have the land use. So did you ever think of doing a report on that?
So we actually, about a year ago, released 2 reports that were relevant to community boards and specifically looking at points of agreement documents that are related to neighborhood rezonings. And I can find those really quickly and throw them in the chat. I think that they might contain some helpful information. If you have a more specific question, I'm happy to think about that too.
The budget is going to be cut, right? Some of these community boards are very close to each other. And every community board pays rent, secretaries. Did you ever study perhaps do a study that some of this, say, 3 community boards can be combined And some of the rent can be actually used for urban planners to address the question of rezoning. I mean, it's like one of the major topics that happens in community boards.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that idea floated, and IBO hasn't looked into that specifically. I'm not exactly sure what legal considerations would have to be factored in there, try to merge community boards, but it's an interesting idea. We'll definitely keep it in mind and we could take a look.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to do a
Absolutely.
shameless plug for IBO that that was the exact kind of thing that we love to get questions about, like some kind of research question that you're interested in based on like IBO's capacity. We love to look into questions, and a lot of our research is sparked by community questions and requests. So if you have something like even unrelated to our presentations today, please feel free to reach out to any of us.
Yep, that's a great point. Thank you for making that point. And just to clarify, because we are a city agency, we do all of this for free. I mean, it's not like we don't like having clients that have to pay us. If we had data and we had capacity to answer your question, we do our best to. Please reach out.